For sure. That's what I do.
I'm Thomas Seager. The introduction is on point. I'm an associate professor in the School of Sustainable Engineering at ASU. So I'm an engineer, and I'm also the CEO of the Morosco Forge Ice Bath Company. You can see one of our models is out by the pond. I want to talk this morning about why I think cold plunge is good for everybody in the United States. Because on social media, it's now very popular to bash ice baths, to criticize ice baths. You get a lot of clicks for it, but it's not founded in science or in case studies. What I'm going to do is show you a combination of both, the science and the experience of cold plunge, and I'm going to start here. There are 4 glaciers at the equator in East Africa in modern times. There's a misconception that people at the equatorial latitudes, somehow they don't get cold. But where does Wim Hof take his trainees to do his super mountain climb? He goes to Mount Kilimanjaro, which is on the equator. Since the oldest human fossils have been found in East Africa, our best conjecture about what happened to Homo sapiens, what happened to the human population during the ice age of 70,000 years ago, is that it was squeezed into a narrow strip of land on the coastline of Africa between glaciers and the ocean. What did those humans do then to survive? They foraged in the water. Humans are aquatic creatures. That is, the Homo sapiens evolved at the water's edge. One of the reasons that we walk upright, it's not to see over the tall grass. It is to wade through the water. So you have a picture here of a chimpanzee walking on 2 legs. Of course, it's fording the water. Although the DNA in the nucleus that the chimps have sort of matches the Homo sapien DNA, the human DNA, but to 99%, there are anatomical features that distinguish the human being from the chimpanzee that suggest we are aquatic mammals. Chimps, bonobos, apes, they don't have the subcutaneous fat that, I have plenty of. It's that fat that you can pinch around your belly. My nostrils, like yours, they point down rather than out. And so when I dive into the water, it doesn't go straight up into my brain. The downward facing nostrils help keep the water out of my nose when I'm swimming. These are the anatomical features, just like walking on 2 legs, that suggest we're aquatic. But this is the real kicker. Human babies are born with an instinct to swim. Now, if you watch National Geographic, you see the giraffe come out of its mother, and like an hour later, it's prancing around the plains or whatever. The human baby takes about a year to learn to just toddle along on its 2 legs, but it is born with an instinct to swim. And that's because our ancient grandmothers were aquatic. They likely gave birth in the water. Hydrotherapy during labor helps reduce pain and ease the pain of labor. It also helps protect the birthing mother from predators by washing away the sense of the labor, by disguising the vulnerability of the birthing mother. Our ancient grandmothers likely gave birth in the water, which is why our babies are prepared to swim. And that water during that ice age was cold. Whomever didn't have the right mitochondria to conduct cold thermogenesis, to keep the body warm in the cold water, didn't make it through that population bottleneck. We are all descended from ancestors who are capable of using the mitochondria for non-shivering cold thermogenesis. And because our mitochondria do not reproduce sexually like the DNA in the nucleus, the mitochondria have their own DNA, and they are inherited exclusively from the mother. Although they do mutate, we have essentially the same mitochondria that the people who survived that ice age have. If you're not getting cold, you are neglecting your mitochondria, and you will lose something essential to human survival called brown fat. Babies are born with copious quantities of brown fat. It is how they stay warm. Everyone is familiar with shivering. Shivering is another form of cold thermogenesis. When you get cold, your muscles shiver, they generate heat, and they keep you warm. Brown fat is non-shivering thermogenesis. Brown fat is packed with mitochondria, and those mitochondria are capable of producing heat in the cold without the shivering. This is essential for babies because babies don't have the muscles that are mature enough to shiver. So this is a map of where brown fat shows up in a human infant. It used to be that medical doctors thought this was just baby fat and that human adults outgrow it. By the time you become an adult, they said, well, there's no such thing as brown fat. Until 2007. There's something called positron emission tomography, which they use to map tumors inside the human body. The PET machine uses a lot of power. You have to keep it cool in order for it to work. And so sometimes the instrument rooms are a little chilly. And in Sweden, they got these PET scans from cancer patients that were showing up symmetrical bodies. Tumors are not symmetrical. And so this Swedish team of researchers in 2007 said, we think we have located brown fat inside the adult human body. The way the PET scan works is they have to inject you with radioactive glucose. The tumor cell preferentially takes up the radioactive glucose. You go into the PET scan room and it shows the radioactivity. The brown fat was taking up the glucose as well in the chilly instrument room. And so it was showing up on the PET scan. Cancer researchers at the Sloan Kettering Institute in New York said, that's ridiculous. We know there's no such thing as brown fat in the adult human being. We've got 10,000 PET scans from our cancer patients. We're gonna take a look at them and we're gonna see whether these Swedes are full of crap. This is what they found. 5% of their patients showed brown fat. And that means 95% of the cancer patients at the Sloan Kettering Institute had zero detectable brown fat. Turns out that in America, brown fat declines with age. Teenagers still have a lot of it, but by the time you hit 45, fewer than 5% of the American population has any brown fat at all. And you might say, well, that's because we stay warm. You know, we have our heated leather seats and we have our creature comforts. What would we possibly need brown fat for? As long as we're warm, we can turn up the thermostat and we can have the furnace do the job that our brown fat used to do. But brown fat is not just for cold thermogenesis. It is an essential secretory organ. So I put up a slide here. There are lots of metabolic benefits of brown fat. It will reverse type 2 diabetes. It's associated with a healthier lipid panel. All these things are terrific, and I want to focus on what's in the box. Brown fat is associated with improved sex function and fertility, better birth outcomes. Brown fat is in constant communication with your thyroid. It will modulate thyroid function. So if you lose all of your brown fat, it's no wonder that your thyroid becomes dysregulated. I have 3 cases, 2 in Hashimoto's hypothyroidism that is resolved through cold plunge therapy, and 1 in Graves. Because when you recruit the new brown fat, and adults can do this with a regular practice of deliberate cold exposure, you recruit the new brown fat and it will modulate the thyroid. And then lastly, brown fat secretes neuroprotective factors that will help heal traumatic brain injury or protect the brain against injury. So I'm going to talk about some of these, and the first one is pregnancy. Pregnancy is a physiological state of insulin resistance. There is so much growth hormone going through the pregnant woman's body that it requires more insulin to get the glucose into the cells. And this is totally normal. But many of the complications of pregnancy are associated with insulin resistance gone amok. That could be gestational diabetes. But before you go all the way to gestational diabetes, there could be preeclampsia. There could be placental insufficiency. And these are all associated with excess insulin resistance. And insulin resistance has become pathological rather than physiological. Women who cold plunge during pregnancy experience better birth outcomes, and for a lot of reasons. One of those is called mitobiogenesis, Remember that the brown fat, which can be recruited by the body under regular cold exposure, the brown fat is packed with mitochondria. One of the best ways to stimulate mitobiogenesis, if not the best way, is an ice bath. When you get into the ice bath, you apply a hormetic thermal stressor to your body. Your body responds by removing damaged mitochondria and replacing them with new high-quality mitochondria. This improves the metabolic health of any human being, and it's especially important to pregnant women. What are the implications of that? We now understand that one of the adverse outcomes of insulin resistance, pathological insulin resistance during pregnancy, is autism. An autism diagnosis in the child before the age of 10 is associated with insulin resistance or metabolic and mitochondrial dysfunction during pregnancy. To prevent autism, we've got to get the metabolism of the pregnant woman right. There's two steps to that. One is the gut microbiome that produces the substrate that flows through the bloodstream that fuels the mitochondria, and the second is the mitochondria. This, from left to right, is Jay Bhattacharya, who appeared on the Huberman Lab podcast, me, Richard Fry, who's the world's leading expert on the mitochondrial theory of autism, and Nicole Rincon, who's a physician assistant. She suffered from PCOS, that is polycystic ovarian syndrome, while she was trying to conceive. That led to complications in conception, and of course, that led to intervention. She had triplets. At the age of two of those triplets, the boys experienced neurological regression. She has recovered their autism diagnosis. That is, she's recovered the neurological capabilities in her children. It's taken 9 years, and she's doing it by using therapies that target the mitochondria. Her message now is that we can prevent autism by taking care of the mother's mitochondria, and we can reverse autism by using the therapies that will repair mitochondria in the autistic children. Now we're going to talk about the men. Although pregnancy is the most intensive metabolic thing that a woman could ever undergo, you might think, well, men, they don't have a lot metabolically invested. And that's true to some extent. Erectile dysfunction is the first clinical marker of pathological insulin resistance in the man. And it is the correction of another misconception that revealed this. Doctors used to think that the endothelial cells responsible for vasodilation didn't rely upon mitochondria because there aren't a lot of mitochondria in those endothelial cells until this paper came out. When they studied the endothelial cells under the conditions on which they are producing nitric oxide that signals vasodilation, allowing the blood to flow into the penis, they realized that the ATP was coming from mitochondria. When a man's mitochondria are damaged, his dick doesn't work. When you get into the ice bath, you might think, oh, I'm worried about shrinkage because I know that episode on Seinfeld and I'd be so embarrassed. Just the opposite is true. The ice bath stimulates the mitobiogenesis and it creates like a Viagra for your whole body. I wrote about this. This is in my second book, Uncommon Testosterone. And it was an experience that I had with my sex hormones that motivated me to look into this further. This is what happened to me when I got my first labs back. I was 51 years old. This is 8 years ago. And what came out of my lab report was a prostate-specific antigen number 7.0. That is too high, which is why it's in red. I went straight to, WebMD, Mayo Clinic, whatever it was. And it took me 20 minutes of browsing around online to convince myself that I was going to die of prostate cancer. Because that's the way, the web works. It fuels these catastrophic thoughts. And what the web told me I needed to do was immediately get a prostate exam. And then once the prostate exam shows the inflammation that is showing up on my lab test, of course, urologists can say, well, we should do a biopsy. And a biopsy of your prostate is one of the most painful, excruciating things, according to the men who've had them, that has ever happened. Not only that, but the rate of false positives on a prostate biopsy is very high. So they pull 16 tissue samples out of the prostate. By the way, I've never done this, but I talked to a lot of men who have gone through it. And of those 16, let's say maybe 6 or 7 pop positive for cancer. At this point, you don't know whether these are false positives or whether you really have cancer, and your urologist will recommend a prostatectomy, which is a lifetime sentence of erectile dysfunction. Me in my mood at this age, where I had just split from my wife, I was thinking, what woman would ever love me if I couldn't ever get a hard-on again? I was faced with this choice, at least in my mind. I could choose my life or my penis. Now, I chose my penis because I couldn't imagine. You know, I know that prostate is like a very slow-acting cancer. I couldn't imagine going through the biopsy. I couldn't imagine going through the prostatectomy. And I couldn't imagine, the next 50 years of my life without the sex life that I'd been accustomed to. So I was determined to do whatever I could to avoid this allopathic route. And I chose ice baths. That's when I started doing it every single day. I cycled in and out of keto. I don't like staying in keto forever, but I like going in there a couple of days a week. And every single morning, I'm getting into that damn ice bath because I thought my life depended upon it. By the way, I've got one out here. It was at 38 degrees an hour ago when I checked it and still cooling. So you can have this experience for yourself, and it sucks. Nobody enjoys a freezing cold ice bath. You have to have a reason to do it. And mine was, I'm gonna get my PSA down. It took me 4 months to have the courage to retest my blood. Because you can imagine, if I go in and have the blood drawn and the PSA's gone up, I don't know what I'm gonna do. This is what I came back with, 1.8, right? It worked. A couple of months later, I tested again, and the PSA was all the way down to 1.1, and something else popped up on my labs. This is my total testosterone. That is 1180 nanograms per deciliter. There is no way that a fat, sedentary college professor is gonna pop 1180 nanograms per deciliter. That's like the testosterone levels of an oversexed 19-year-old. So when I finally got to my urologist, I got my 1.1 PSA. I'm like, I'm gonna get a big pat on the back. I'm gonna get a congratulations. He's gonna ask me how I do it. He's gonna change his whole practice, right? He didn't care. All he saw was the 1180. Now, we're about the same age, this urologist. And, he's a guy like me, and he's like, there's no way. He's like, you're juicing. And I'm like, I don't even know what juicing is. He goes, I want one more test. He goes, I want to test your luteinizing hormone. No, I didn't know luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is what signals the testes to produce testosterone. So if my total testosterone was high and my luteinizing hormone was low, he would know that I'm on some kind of exogenous testosterone cream, injection, whatever. And he would caution me. He would say, total testosterone is associated with an increased risk of prostate cancer. This is what urologists are taught. And so they'll often put their prostate cancer patients on a testosterone suppressing agent. And so he wants to know, am I natural or am I lying to him? Luteinizing hormone comes back 8.9. It is off the charts high. I never heard from my urologist again. I was naive about what data might do to convince him. But I was also thinking, geez, if high testosterone is really associated with an increased risk of prostate cancer, then maybe I should be worried. I had to figure out what was happening to me. I found this study from 1991 that showed if you do your cold plunge after your exercise, which I do not recommend, it will suppress your testosterone levels. It will suppress your luteinizing hormone. But if you do your cold before your exercise, which is what I was doing, it will boost your testosterone. It will boost your luteinizing hormone. This is true for men. As it turns out, women are different. Women, most of them don't understand that testosterone is the dominant sex hormone in women, just like it is in men. Although men have like 10 times as much testosterone. Women have more total testosterone in their bloodstream than they have estradiol. And most of it is not made in the ovaries. The ovaries account for about a quarter. The rest of a woman's testosterone is made in the skin cells, in the adrenal glands, and in fat cells. What better way to stimulate the skin, adrenals, and fat cells than a cold plunge? Women will get an immediate testosterone boost from an ice bath. Men must exercise afterwards. So why would women want more testosterone? For all the reasons that men do. The single greatest reason for a clinician to prescribe testosterone to a woman is low libido, because testosterone is the lust hormone, both in men and in women. Unfortunately, there are no FDA-approved protocols to treat low testosterone in women. So any clinician who wants to do this has to adapt a male protocol to the female cycle and just figure it out as you go along. My view is a much better way, both for men and women, is to stimulate the production of testosterone inside their own body. But there's something about this hormonal response to the cold plunge, stimulating the production of the lust hormone, that can happen between two people that helps repair a relationship. I've had this experience myself, and I have duplicated it with 2 other couples. What we do is we take a couple, it's better than therapy. You put them in the ice bath together. We have a protocol for this. You hold hands, you make eye contact, you breathe together. And the response in the woman is most profound. At about 1 minute and 10 seconds, she will giggle. She will turn to the camera and smile. I'm not kidding. It's like a robot. We have 3 different videos, and they're all time-stamped the same way. Then she will begin to flirt with her partner, which is often mysterious to the man. But guys, just go with it. You're not feeling that testosterone boost yet, but she is. My thing was, at 2 minutes and 10 seconds, we were making out in the ice bath, and the videographer was like, cut, we're done, you guys get a room. When we duplicated this with other couples, we saw the same kind of response. It's not just testosterone, it is also oxytocin, it is vasopressin, and it is the other neurotransmitters and hormones associated with love. You cannot help, when you use this protocol, but feel the neurotransmitters and hormones that are associated with bonding, romantic love, and lust when you do this with your partner. So all of this is a new discovery. I wrote these kinds of things up, put it on an article, morozcoforge.com, and of course, nobody read it. Because you don't go to Morozco for health advice, you go to Cleveland Clinic or something like that, except for one guy. Joe Rogan read it. Joe's a customer. And this was shortly after Liver King was caught, doping. Of course Liver King's on steroids. This was obvious to the world. You could just sort of admit it, and nobody would. He's funny. People are still going to watch him. But Joe, he got interested, and he had Derek More Plates, More Dates on to talk about testosterone. This is an episode with David Goggins. And Joe said, I'm doing something new. I saw this guy. This is the only time I've been cited as this guy, but I'm going to take it. And he put my face in my article up on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. Some people paused it. They searched to find who this guy was. They finally found my article. They started writing to me. And it allowed me to document several case studies, people who were doing their labs before and after a practice of cold plunge therapy. This is Sean Smiley, a firefighter who lost a testicle in a training accident. His total testosterone went all the way down to the 200s. His physician said, we're gonna put you on TRT. He hated it. He started doing an ice bath. He got all the way up to 900 nanograms per deciliter, which is pretty good for a firefighter with one nut. This is Eloise DeSouter, who she's in her early 30s. She doesn't have any children. She's thinking about, how do I preserve my fertility? She starts doing ice baths every, 2-3 times a week. She does her labs before and after on the 3rd day of her cycle. She sends them to me. Almost a 50% increase in her total testosterone. Her estradiol also went up. This is Pamela Butler. Pamela Butler has no ovaries. She has no hysterectomy. She was surgically entered into menopause when she had her ovaries and her uterus surgically removed. She was one of these people on testosterone replacement therapy. When she started doing ice baths every day, 10x increase in her total testosterone, and her clinician was like, we've got to get you off the exogenous stuff. And then finally, this is David Wooten, traumatic brain injury, PTSD. He was in the airborne. His testosterone went down into the upper 200s, and unfortunately, testosterone is associated with mood. At this point, David didn't want to live. He's having suicidal thoughts. And talk therapy is not going to lift a man with low T out of his depression. But ice baths did. Remember I said ice baths were good for the brain. They are also good for the mood. And David moved his testosterone with a combination of TRT and ice baths every day up to 1400. So these are documented case studies that are in the book, and we finally understand the mechanism. That mechanism is the mitochondria. It is the mitochondria where testosterone synthesis originates. There's a cholesterol molecule that is found inside the mitochondria, and when it contacts an enzyme called P450SCC, that enzyme will cleave the cholesterol molecule into a sex steroid called pregnenolone. That pregnenolone then is metabolized into all the sex hormones. It's into cortisol and, of course, to testosterone. If your mitochondria, men or female, or men or women, if your mitochondria don't work, then your testosterone synthesis does not work. So the mechanism by which the ice bath produces these sex hormones is through mitobiogenesis and the improved mitochondrial function. And increased testosterone does not cause prostate cancer. It protects against prostate cancer. This is coming from Dr. Abraham Morgentaler, who's probably the leading scientist and practitioner on the relationship between testosterone and prostate. This is another massive misconception that somehow elevated testosterone levels, because it's anabolic, will promote prostate cancer or tumor growth, and it does not. The clinical data shows exactly the opposite, which is the only thing that makes sense to me. And so now men come up to me after a talk like this and they say, look, I've got an elevated PSA. My oncologist has got me on testosterone blockers. Do you think that's right? And I have to say, I'm not a physician, I'm an engineer. I make machines. And even if I were a physician, I'm not your physician. All I can tell you is that the data disagrees with your oncologist. This is very unsettling for the men who see my talks or read my books. And what they tell me is this: I believe you, Professor Seager. It makes sense to me, Professor Seager. But my daughter or my wife or my loved ones, they want me to do what the doctor is telling me to do. They say they care about me, and they would never tolerate me giving up my oncologist's advice so I can get into some crazy ice bath. They want me to do everything I can to stay alive. It is very difficult to resist, especially the daughters, who love you and want you to take care of yourself, and say, you know what, dear, I'm gonna go another way. I read this book by this engineer at Arizona State University, and it seemed to work for him. So screw the oncologist. I don't know how to give the men the courage to try. Very few of them will. All I do is keep telling this story. If you're in this circumstance, of course we can talk later. The data disagrees with any oncologist that would prescribe testosterone suppression as a treatment for prostate cancer. Metabolism is at the origin of every single leading cause of death from chronic illness in the United States. You don't have to take my word for it. Here's Ben Bickman's book, Why We Get Sick. Cancer, of course, is one of the adverse outcomes that comes from metabolic dysfunction. Here's me and Ben talking about pregnancy, and here is Thomas Seyfried's book, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease. I'm going to tell you how cold can prevent cancer and can improve cancer treatment outcomes. Here's some more of that data. This is when you add ketosis to chemotherapy. You get much better cancer treatment outcomes. This is what happens when you house mice with tumors implanted in them at 4 degrees centigrade for 4 hours a day. Compared to controls, those mice live longer and they have lower tumor volumes. This is the mechanism by which those mice experienced inhibited tumor growth. It is brown fat uptaking glucose from the bloodstream and starving the tumor cells. So this is another brown fat story. When you activate the brown fat, you clear glucose from the bloodstream. It preferentially finds that glucose and prevents it from being used as the metabolic substrate for growth in the tumor cell. This is Dean Hall. Dean Hall was diagnosed with a chronic leukemia. Now, chronic leukemia means it's going to take a while to kill him, but it will kill him. he went to his doctor. He'd already lost his wife to a brain tumor, and he said, "Doc, I want to do something to inspire other cancer patients before I go." And the doc says, "What do you want to do?" Dean says, "I want to swim the entire length of the Willamette River in my home state of Oregon. It's 187 miles long." And the doctor says, "Dean, if you so much as set foot in a public pool with your immune system the way it is, it could kill you." Dean says, "Well, then I don't have anything to lose." He starts training. His father supports him. His daughter supports him. It takes him 3 weeks to swim this river. And he goes in and out of hypothermia. He wrote a book called The Wild Cure. You can read my foreword. Shivering, ketosis, his medical doctor flew out, estimated that Dean had 4% body fat, which can be lethally low. But that's how cold he was for those 3 weeks. When he got into the Willamette River, he had chronic leukemia. When he came out, of course, his family was saying, "You've got to go back to the oncologist. We're so worried about you. We have no idea what you've done to your system. You may have shortened your life." And Dean said, okay, I'll go. He went back to the same oncologist that did his original diagnosis. They drew the blood. It was free of leukemia. And the oncologist said, "If I had not done this diagnosis myself, I would swear that you were misdiagnosed, because there is no trace of leukemia in your body, and there hasn't been since." Dean, of course, hypothesized that it was those 3 weeks of intense exercise and cold exposure that healed him of an incurable leukemia. This is another case study. This is a woman who's a single mother of 4. I got a phone call when I was in Texas. She said, "I'm in acute abdominal pain." Well, go to the hospital. No, I think maybe I don't know, maybe I've got a cyst or something like that. Just go to the hospital. When I got back to Phoenix, because this is a friend of mine, she was checked into the hospital, but she didn't want to tell her kids. The 4 daughters that depend upon her, all of whom, I guess the oldest was 17 at the time. And she didn't want to tell them. Of course, I brought them to the hospital. What do the doctors say? And she said, "I have an inoperable tumor on my liver. You cannot cut into the liver because it's just all blood vessels, and she has a history of a bleeding disorder." So her case went all the way up to the tumor board at the hospital. They said, "Nope, we can't cut it out. We can't treat it with radiation. Chemo isn't going to help." "Well, what can they do?" I asked. She said, "They recommend watchful waiting." Now, that's what they can put on your gravestone. "We tried watchful waiting." Because a tumor comes out of nowhere. Now, this woman had a history of type 2 diabetes, and remember that metabolic dysfunction is associated with cancer. And she resolved the type 2 diabetes using keto and ice baths, but the cancer seemingly came out of nowhere. She said, "What am I going to do?" I said, "You're going to do what Dean Hall did. You're going to get into that ice bath. You're going to do it every day. You're going to stay in keto. You're going to cut out the soda. You're going to cut out the fruit juice. You're going to cut out all the processed carbs. There's no room for any of these in your diet anymore. We're not shooting for an HbA1c of less than 6. We're shooting for the tumor." She did that. This is her Twitter post. Took her 2 months, and her blood work came back. She called it 3 pages of perfect. 2 months later, she had a scan. That tumor shrunk. Afterwards, we hit the COVID lockdowns. She couldn't get, because that scan is an elective procedure. Anything that can be scheduled is elective. She couldn't get scans anymore. She said, "Screw it. I don't trust the medical system. I don't ever want to go back for another scan." She did suffer the type of abdominal pain, which was her tumor bleeding out. She suffered that one more time. And it was after, it was ice cream that was her downfall in that case. And for some reason, it might have spiked her blood sugar. It might have activated that tumor. And it was enough for her to learn her lesson. When she was experiencing that, I'm like, "You going back to the hospital?" She said, "No, they won't let me in with my daughters anymore. And I would rather die at home than alone in the hospital." She made me promise that I would never take her back to the hospital without her daughters, as long as these lockdowns were in place, which is a very difficult thing to do. And I said, okay. She's never had another scan, and she's never had another relapse of that pain. Because why? Because she's managing it metabolically instead of using watchful waiting. This is a text message. Now that I've published these case studies, I get these text messages periodically. I get maybe 2 of them a month. And you can take a minute and read it. Most people do not eschew the allopathic route altogether. They might try chemo if their oncologist is recommending it. When you add cold plunge therapy on top, the outcomes improve. So one way to treat your cancer is to cut it out or to burn it out or to chemo it out. And another way is to use the cold plunge therapy to keep your metabolism strong while you're undergoing that. When you combine them, I get text messages like this all the time saying the outcomes are better. I'm gonna go through some of these other cases. Remember I said that cold plunge therapy was good for the brain. This is my mother. This is 2 weeks before she died. I couldn't visit her for a long time during the lockdowns. She lives in New York State, which is incredibly problematic. The lockdowns are lifted, and I go out to see my mother. This is breakfast. Do you see anything wrong with this picture? Because I do. That's a chocolate chip cookie for breakfast. This is what they fed her for breakfast. This is a picture I took of her kitchen. Now, she suffers from acute, like she's far gone. She doesn't recognize me at all. She suffers from Alzheimer's, and it's gonna kill her. And they are feeding her cream of wheat made with Ensure. And if you're familiar with Ensure, it's sweeteners and seed oils. They are destroying her mitochondria. And at this point, it's merciful. She doesn't even know who I am. I put this picture of my grandfather. This is her father, for whom I'm named, up on the picture. And I think maybe there was a glint of recognition in her eye. If she finished her cream of wheat made with Ensure and apple juice, she got a cookie for a reward. And it took her 2 hours to eat it because she did not have control, like motor control, of anything but her dominant hand. She's right-handed, and she could barely pick the crumbs off the plate and feed herself. 2 weeks later, mercifully, she passed. Alzheimer's is sometimes called type 3 diabetes because it is a metabolic disorder. The brain, Ben Bickman tells me, prefers ketones. When you are in a mitochondrially impaired state, when you suffer from mitochondrial dysfunction, of course the brain doesn't have the energy that it needs. Of course you can't think through things, but it's worse than that. The physiology of the brain changes. And Jay Bhattacharya, whom I showed you earlier, who's now, he's a friend because he's also an anti-lockdowner and a faculty member, but he's now the director of the NIH. As part of his Senate confirmation testimony, he acknowledged the fact that all of the Alzheimer's research that is predicated on the amyloid plaque hypothesis was built on fraud. The NIH has been pouring millions of dollars into fraudulent research because the amyloid plaque hypothesis is crap. The metabolic route is how you treat Alzheimer's, how you prevent and treat Alzheimer's. Increased levels of brown fat are associated with lower levels of dementia. It is the hormetic stress of the cold that stimulates your body to upgrade the mitochondria. You don't get enough cold and you will suffer. This is the classic inverted U curve. You don't get enough cold and you will suffer poor outcomes. But don't overdo it. There's no reason to get too much. Joe Rogan's second ice bath was 20 minutes in his Morozko, up to his neck in ice. Is probably the most boring 20 minutes he's ever posted on Instagram because it's just him shivering the entire time. 2 to 3 minutes. If you are starting a new cold plunge practice, if you're getting in this morning, go cold enough to gasp. You will feel the gasp reflex. That's the activation of your parasympathetic nervous system, so your fight or flight response. Go long enough to shiver, and you have the right dose. People often ask me, well, what's the optimal temperature? Well, what's the optimal duration? And it's the wrong question. Just like if you were starting a weight training program, I wouldn't be able to tell you the optimal weight to lift or the optimal number of reps. You have to you have to rely upon knowledge of your own body. What is your prior state of weight training? What is your prior state of cold training? So if you're starting a new practice, because now you're inspired by these cases in this science, go cold enough to gasp, go long enough to shiver. After about 2 weeks, you will recruit new brown fat into your body, and you will not feel the same urge to shiver. So cold enough to gasp is still a good rule of thumb, but you don't have to stay in there long enough to shiver. 2 to 4 minutes is all I do, and I do it every day because I'm trying to hit that middle part, that upside in the hormetic stress curve. I'm not trying to burn myself out. I'm trying to stimulate myself, and it feels great. Lots of questions that I get. I can address all of these. Cold showers are not the same as whole body. Cold showers is good metabolically, but you never get that parasympathetic response. When you gasp, that's the sympathetic fight or flight. The parasympathetic is associated with the dive reflex. When you do partial body cold immersion, you never get that dive reflex. You don't get that parasympathetic. There is one exception. You can dunk your face into cold water. You will get a parasympathetic response without doing the whole body. But I like to breathe, so I don't do that face dunk thing. I go in up to my neck, and a sense of calm comes over me that is not associated with cold showers. Deliberate cold exposure does not promote long-term weight loss. You might lose 5 to 10 pounds. Most of it is inflammation. There are a lot of people who have reported this to me. But long-term, cold exposure is not going to help you lose weight. It may boost your testosterone. It will change your body composition, but the scale will not change because of a long-term program of cold plunge therapy. I've addressed the best water temperature and for how long, cold enough to gasp, long enough to shiver. A lot of people now on Instagram are writing to me and say, what about burning out my adrenals? Cortisol is misunderstood. If you are starting off, you will get a cortisol spike. Just like if you were doing a workout, you will get a cortisol spike from the cold plunge. The more you do it, the long-term studies that follow people for 2 weeks show that your body acclimates to the cold, and you no longer get the cortisol spike. They also show that if you're in an elevated cortisol state when you do a cold plunge, it will not move you higher. And so there's a lot of misinformation for clicks on cortisol and adrenals. Where can you buy the books? And I think we still have 3 minutes. Carrie, if it's all right to take a question from the audience.
Do you have protocol for women who have luteal phases and stuff like that, you know?
Okay, so do I have a protocol for
right.
women?
Yeah.
There are a number of protocols, and the most popular, of course, is for men with the prostate, and then the protocol for couples. And so I haven't targeted a protocol for like pregnant women or for women specifically. So this is a great question. There are 3 protocols for athletes that could be adapted for a woman depending upon what she's working on. The first is for injury recovery, inflammation. The second is for psychological resilience. And then the third is pre-cooling for performance. So the extent that a woman is an athlete, all 3 of those protocols apply. And that's probably not what you're asking. You might be asking, women have a cycle. And I want to know what should I do at different points in my cycle? Now, this is not my area of personal expertise. There is a woman at the University of the Lithuanian Sports University. Her name is Rima Solianic, and she's done some of the best work. It seems like it comes from the Eastern European countries. Best work on women and cold plunge therapy. And what she saw is that as a population, women are more sensitive if they're naive to cold. Among subjects who've never done cold, women have a stronger reaction. They also respond faster to cold training than men do. And of course, she's working with a Lithuanian population. So what might we conclude? We could make the mistake of concluding that women have some inherently biological difference between men that makes them more sensitive to cold. You could hypothesize that, and you'd be totally wrong. You would also be named Stacy Sims, and you would be on much more popular podcasts than, Professor Seager. Women in Lithuania experience less cold than men in Lithuania. Men work the outdoor jobs. Men are the cops and the firefighters and the garbage collectors and the woodsmen and the herders and things like that. As a population, women are less cold trained in Lithuania than men are, but the overlap is extraordinary. So to talk about women as a general population is to ask the wrong question. The question is, what is right for you? And this depends upon the woman's goals. In menopause or post-menopause, I'm not worried. There is no cycle. Just get in there. But It is true that cold will activate the immune system. So if you are a woman seeking to conceive and you've read my article and you're like, look, you know, I want to improve my chances. I know that a metabolically healthy woman doesn't really experience the adverse outcomes of advanced age, like being 38 or 39 or something, as long as her mitochondria are good. How do I use the cold plunge to kill my mitochondria? You go right up to the day before you're expecting to ovulate, and then give yourself 3 days after ovulation. You do not want to activate the immune system just in case that zygote fails to implant in the uterine wall because the immune system is overstimulated. So you take like 5 days off. And then if you're pregnant, you could take a month or two off, especially at the beginning of the pregnancy. The insulin resistance and the growth hormone haven't really kicked in. Second trimester, third trimester, you go right back into the ice bath. You get the inflammation down, you sleep better. Women who complain of sore joints, swollen ankles, things like that, find that ice bath remedies those conditions. That's a great question. Thanks for asking it, Mary, and I think we're done.